Final Fantasy VII. The utterance of these three words compels reverence from every member of the gaming community. Even if you personally are not a fan of FF7 or don't rank it as high as the other Final Fantasy games, you cannot deny the impact this game has had on the gaming medium. Every artistic discipline that is represented in this game was state-of-the-art in 1997, and in some respects it still is today. The characters, the world building, the music, and let us not forget how mind-blowing it was to play a Final Fantasy game in 3 dimensions back in the day. I recently finished going through it for the first time, and I have to say that I was blown away by its presentation. In fact, out of the 3 Final Fantasy games that I've played so far, it might be my favorite. Granted, this preference is in part due to the game's lore. Though Final Fantasy X and IX had wonderful concepts and storytelling, I find the lore in Final Fantasy VII to be the most expertly crafted that I have witnessed thus far. Like the other 2 games, Final Fantasy VII synthesized different religious inspirations in order to birth its own unique worlds. Unlike those other 2 games, though, it seems that FF7 chose to juggle a greater number of inspirations and still succeeded in doing so. I will note that Final Fantasy IX is apparently an amalgamation of inspirations from the previous 8 games, so maybe my appreciation of that game will surpass FF7 in the future. For now, however, the superior synthesis seems to be with FF7. Just like I did with Final Fantasy X and IX, I will elucidate FF7's religious inspirations so we may develop a deeper understanding and appreciation for the game. Admittedly, this is going to be a bit tricky. Obviously, Final Fantasy VII is a game that has been examined and analyzed backwards and forwards. Anybody who is a hardcore fan of the game is already well aware of its ties to things like the Hebrew Kabbalah, Norse mythology, Gnosticism, and classical Asian iconography. If you, the viewer, consider yourself to be a hardcore fan of FF7, 70 to 80% of this video will feel like a retread. Nonetheless, that means 20% of this video might contain discoveries that nobody else seems to have noticed or spoken up about, at least with the research I have done. Before we get to those original perspectives, allow me to set things up by going over a few things that are well known inside the FF7 fan community. Obviously, if you're going to talk about the religious influences of this game, the first thing that immediately comes to mind is Sephiroth, and how his name references a concept in the Lurian Kabbalah, a form of Jewish Gnosticism. Before I get to the concept of Sephiroth, though, I'll provide a quick recap on Gnosticism. Like I explained in my video on FF10, Gnosticism is a marriage of Judeo-Christian concepts with psychological experience. For instance, the struggle of trying to live in the 2nd century caused some Gnostics to believe that the world was not, in fact, ruled by a benevolent god, but an ignorant and incompetent one called the Demiurge. Though the Gnostics believed in a benevolent god, it was not aware of humanity and their plight. This concept of the Demiurge was reflected in the creature known as Sin in Final Fantasy X, a false god who mistreated those it ruled over. With that addressed, I shall now explain the Judeo-Gnostic concept of the Sephiroth and its heavy relation to Final Fantasy VII. In the Lurian Kabbalah, there is what is known as the 10 emanations, or 10 Sephirot, of Ein Sof. Ein Sof is one of the many Jewish terms that refer to the highest power. God, Yahweh, Jehovah, the Infinite, whatever you want to call it. At the beginning of time, Ein Sof shined a light out from his eyes into the dark void. This light coalesced into a being known as Adam Kadmon, an anthropomorphic being that was basically the first man ever created. A being created in the image of Ein Sof. Then from Adam Kadmon's eyes shone another ray of light into the void. This ray of light was Adam Kadmon's essence, which he poured into 10 vessels. These 10 vessels, plus Adam Kadmon at the top, make up what is known as the Sephirotic tree. In the simplest terms, the Sephirotic tree is the body of the primordial man split up into 10 segments. 7 of these segments were unable to contain the light that Adam Kadmon poured into them and shattered. an event that is known in the Jewish Kabbalah as Shevirat HaKalim, the shattering of the vessels. The shards of these vessels, along with the light that was contained within, spread throughout the void and created our universe. That's what the Sephiroth/Sephirot is, but we have yet to establish any connection to FF7 beyond the fact that the villain has the same name. What's interesting to me is that in all my research into the game, I never came across anybody trying to relate the concept of Adam Kadmon to Sephiroth, and his ultimate mission of becoming one with the planet Gaia. Check this out. In the Kabbalah, there's this concept known as tikkun, a Hebrew word which roughly translates to restitution, reparation, or reunion. Supposedly, it is the Kabbalists' duty to reunify the light that fell from the shattered vessels with the body of Adam Kadmon. When this happens, the human race will reunite with the body of Adam Kadmon and enter an eternal paradise. I cannot help but notice that this shares a lot of similarity to Sephiroth's ultimate goal as well as Professor Hojo's reunion theory. I'll begin by addressing the latter. According to Professor Hojo, every being that was infected with Sephiroth's cells, and by extension the Genova cells, would seek to reunite and return to the main body. We see this happen with those who were infected, including Cloud and the other Sephiroth clones at the North Crater. Following this, Sephiroth would attain enough power in order to carry out the final stage of his plan, the one that he revealed at the Temple of the Ancients. Sephiroth's ultimate plan is to become one with the planet Gaia and to rule over every soul. To rule over every soul, he will merge with the Life Stream. The union of every soul on planet Gaia within Sephiroth's body is very similar to the reunion, or tikkun, of every soul within Adam Kadmon. If there is a connection here, then it is very appropriate that Sephiroth was named the way he is. After all, the Sephiroth/Sephirotic tree is synonymous with Adam Kadmon. There's a bit more proof to support this perspective, but it lays outside our current discussion of the Sephirotic tree. I wish to stay on this subject a little while longer because there are other things that relate to the Kabbalah and Judaism in the game. Firstly, Tifa's bar, Seventh Heaven, is a direct reference to the Jewish belief that there are 7 heavens. The 7th of these heavens is the highest heaven, where God and his angels are located, known as the Seraphim. A seraph is a 6-winged angel, a being that bears a striking resemblance to the being that Sephiroth transforms into at the end of the game, a being with 6 wings. Speaking of Tifa, her name might have originated from one of the 10 Sephiroth, the one designated Tifareth. The traits that are associated with this vessel include beauty, compassion, and balance. I should also note that there are different spellings for this vessel, including Tifareth with an A, as well as Tifareth. This leads me to believe that Aerith got her name from this vessel as well. In other words, both Tifa and Aerith represent 2 sides of the same vessel, in name and in temperament. These are the only other relations that I put stock in. There are a couple of others that I don't necessarily believe, but I'll present them for the sake of fun. Firstly, the Tifareth vessel is meant to balance the forces of 2 other Sephiroth, Haud and Netzach. If the names Tifa and Aerith came from Tifareth, I cannot help but think that the character Zack's name came from Netzach, and Cloud's name came from Haud. Cloud, yeah. It's especially appropriate seeing that Aerith is technically Zack's girlfriend and Tifa is Cloud's girlfriend. There might be something there might be not. Then there's the Jewish concept of gematria, which some Final Fantasy fans have tried to link to FF7. In the simplest terms, gematria is the Kabbalist belief that within the Hebrew language is a special code sent to them from God. They attempt to decipher the code by linking each letter of the Hebrew language with a numerical value. Depending on what letters are in a name, those letters will add up to a specific number. Now, if I go to gematrix.org or gematrinator.com, I can calculate the numerical value of various names. If I take the name of the Sephirotic vessel known as Chokmah, the number that pops out is 118. Guess what Cloud's birthday is? August 11th, the 8th month, the 11th day. But wait, it gets better. If I put in Tifareth into the calculator, the number that pops up is 305. What's Tifa's birthday? May the 3rd, the 5th month, the 3rd day. Now with this said, I don't actually buy that the guys behind Final Fantasy VII actually put this much thought into this whole thing. Why? Well, you see, I came across this linking of Gematria to Final Fantasy VII when a wiki entry said that the Gematria of the Sephirotic vessel Chesed was 72, and that Aerith's birthday was February 7th. However, if I go to these calculating websites, I do not see the number 72 pop up anywhere, even when I take other forms of Gematria into consideration. This leads me to believe that the numerical values are pure coincidence, but hey, it's still fun to think about. With that fun stuff out of the way, let's move beyond the Kabbalah and into full-on Gnosticism, of which Kabbalah is only a subcategory. In the Valentinian Gnostic system, there is a being known as Sophia. Sophia was one of 30 emanations of God, contrasted with the 10 in the Sephirotic system. In the Valentinian system, these emanations weren't known as Sephiroth, but as Aeons. Now, where have we heard the name Aeon before? Anyways, Sophia was unlike the 29 other Aeons. She wanted to leave heaven and birth something of her own in the formless void. It is here where she birthed the Demiurge, the concept of the ignorant, incompetent god that was reflected in the character of Sin in Final Fantasy X. With the concept of Sophia and the Demiurge, I can draw two potential parallels to Final Fantasy VII. First, in the case of Jenova, she was like Sophia in that she fell from the infinite heavens above and was, in part, responsible for the creation of Sephiroth. The implanting of her cells into the body of Sephiroth is, in a way, a form of begetting a malevolent demiurge, which Sephiroth tries to become at the end of the game. The second potential parallel is that Jenova could be likened to Einsof, who begat Adam Kadmon. As I briefly pointed out earlier, one of the names that is given to the Jewish god is Jehovah, which is clearly similar to Jenova. In a way, Jenova begetting Sephiroth runs parallel to Jehovah begetting Adam Kadmon. And remember what I said before, Sephiroth and Adam Kadmon are basically the same thing. I will conclude this video by briefly addressing this long-standing controversy between FF7 and FF10. Most hardcore fans will know that there is this implied connection between the two games that none of the original creators want to canonize, aside from one. According to the Japanese FFX2 Ultimania guide, the lead scenario writer for both FF7 and FF10, Kazushige Nojima, states outright that in his mind, both games share the same universe. In FFX2, there is a character that you can come across named Shinra, who speaks about extracting energy from the far plane to use as a source of energy. This, of course, reflects what the Shinra Corporation does in FF7 by extracting Mako energy from the life stream. Keep in mind, though, that Nojima's perspective isn't canon. According to the director of FF7, Yoshinori Kitase, Nojima's perspective is just his, quote, unofficial secret history. So whether or not Final Fantasy X and X-2 are official prequels to FF7 remains to be seen. Although a certain Easter egg in the Final Fantasy VII Remake implies that this connection might eventually be confirmed. We'll see. As for my personal opinion, even if they aren't officially connected, the concepts used in Final Fantasy VII and X are, nonetheless, virtually the same. They just go by different names. The souls of the dead in Final Fantasy VII return to the life stream, where the souls of the dead in Final Fantasy X return to the far plane. Both the life stream and the far plane exist inside their respective planets. Energy can be extracted from both and used for material purposes. In the case of FF7, that energy is Mako, which is used as a fuel source. In Final Fantasy X, I argue that the energy is the Pyreflies. On top of this, both Mako and Pyreflies can crystallize into physical form. In Final Fantasy X, the Pyreflies crystallize into spheres. In Final Fantasy VII, the Mako crystallizes into materia. With this said, it doesn't necessarily mean that 10 and 7 are connected. After all, spiritual energy was used as a fuel source in Final Fantasy IX in the form of mist, the residual essence of souls. Does that mean that Final Fantasy IX is connected to the other games as well? It's impossible to say. Nonetheless, the concept of spiritual energy that resides in all living things is not only consistent across all the Final Fantasy games, but it's consistent across a lot of cultures in real life as well. Whether it's the scintilla vitae or aqua permanens of the alchemists, the chi of the Chinese, or the divine spark in Gnosticism, it's all the same idea. It just goes by a different name. There is even more to Final Fantasy VII's religious inspiration, but for the sake of time and originality, I will refer you to other works that discuss those. If you want to learn more about how Norse mythology influenced Final Fantasy VII, I suggest reading a book by Maurice J. Gallagher, titled Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. I'll also point to a few other worthwhile videos in the description box below. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. If you like this video, please hit that like button. That helps me out enormously. Also, if you like the work I'm doing here, where I go above and beyond your average game theory video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put a link to my Patreon in the description box below. Until my next video, just remember, as always, stay yellow.